Well, first, yeah, thank you guys for having me. Like Chris said, I really love trees, very passionate about them, and I'm glad to be talking about weather-related disasters and the impact on trees and how we can prepare our trees for some of the unpredictability of our weather in the Midwest. And so we're going to talk little bit about what we do with trees before a storm event, you know, and then after an event has occurred, and in a few cases during an event. And so without further ado, so what do we do, you know, before the storm? So, well, you know, it comes down to, you know, luck favors the prepared, right? And so we want to be able to prepare our trees for, you know, to be able to weather whatever might possibly come at them. Hopefully nothing major ever impacts them, but we don't know that in a lot of cases. We don't know that we can avoid major weather-related events. And so it comes down to just preparing our trees and doing the best job that we can before they're really even planted. So you're going to hear me say a couple times today, right tree, right place. This means putting our trees in a site where they are suitable. So like in this picture here, this crabapple is well suited. It's a smaller tree in a boulevard. The root zone is going to have adequate space to grow and support the canopy, support the tree, and provide all that it is going to require to be a resilient, viable tree. Also notice the power lines. This is one of my big passion points, is that putting, you know, large trees under power lines is extremely dangerous. That is compounded when we have storm events, especially ones that affect above ground, you know, in the canopy, like tornadoes, windstorms, ice storms that we'll talk about here. But so putting the right tree in the right place. This includes considering the site characteristics. So I mentioned the boulevard. What is that soil like in that boulevard? Likely compacted, or it has been disturbed, you know, with the construction that has occurred there. Knowing where you're at climatically, you know, climatic zone. I'm in northern Illinois. Some of you are in southern Illinois. Knowing what species are going to do better in those zones, especially when it comes to cold hardiness ratings. But considering also, you know, the soil conditions, utilities and hardscapes, and then existing plantings, and then their maintenance plan. So these are a few of the things that I think are overlooked a little bit, not intentionally. We just get really excited about planting trees and don't take a step back and kind of look at the existing plantings or existing site. And so doing that before you plant a tree can go a long ways to helping trees be resilient. Also considering what tree you're planting in this location. How big is the tree going to get? I already mentioned not planting large trees below power lines, you know, but you know, other things like the growth habit, knowing how that tree is going to form or naturally want to form. Some trees are V-shaped, some trees are more columnar, some are extremely, you know, wide spreading. So knowing what that growth habit is like, so you both can plant the right tree in the right place, but also manage it well. And then we'll get to that in a few minutes. But just knowing about the tree that you're planting is going to go a long ways into helping promote longevity. Your tolerances and resistance to different ailments. Trees have been cultivated and bred for certain, you know, tolerances or resistances to diseases or, you know, like fungal diseases, pests. Also tolerances to like salt or compaction or flooding or dry sites. Just knowing what the tree will tolerate can help you site the tree properly. Your light requirements, the known problems. Knowing what challenges your tree might face can help you mitigate them, or, you know, be prepared to handle those as the tree matures. And then your maintenance requirements, and then finally the attributes. Like trees are beautiful pieces of our landscape, and so, you know, knowing what the attributes are, like these bald cypress. I absolutely love the bald cypress. I know we're not supposed to play favorites, but it is possibly one of my favorites. So it's a deciduous conifer, though. Knowing that, you would not panic every fall when the tree starts to defoliate. You would not automatically think that it is dying. You would know that that is an attribute that the bald cypress provides or offers, and so you would accept it, appreciate it, and continue, you know, enjoying that tree. So once you've gone to all of the work of learning about the site, learning about the tree, planting and establishment, is probably, it is the most important thing you can do to make sure that the tree is able to weather long-term weather-related disasters, human-related disasters, just be able to be the healthiest as it can be. So what does that mean? Well, a proper planting depth is top of the line for me. I'm going to see if my video will work here. And you can see, and I'll talk you through this. So what's happening here is I got this container grown tree. What you're seeing right there, that nub is actually a graft union right there. That's actually where this tree species, the selection from a cultivar was grafted onto a rootstock. And so there's a swelling there, but you can see that that's where it was buried to. What I just found and dug out is the first lateral root. That is the level you should plant this tree at. Oftentimes we see nursery stock come, planted too deep for whatever reason, and then we plant it at that depth when we're in the landscape. That tree is planted too deep, and that can lead to a lot of challenges for the tree as it matures over time. Basically, what's happening is that trunk material is now below ground, and it is exposed to soil pathogens. Moisture is in that soil and being held up against the trunk, and that trunk material is not meant to be below ground. It's meant to be above ground. It's meant to be protection for the tree. And so when it gets buried, then it can be a point of infection. And so we want to make sure that we're planting it at the right depth. And then you want to mulch and water trees. You want to do this as they're getting established, but also long term. This can go a really long ways to help preserve the root zone, to encourage good root development on trees. And we all know that roots are critically important for helping a tree have stability, provide the nutrients and moisture that it needs to be viable. Watering a tree, this will come, you'll hear me say this a couple of times, but planting or watering trees, especially in times of dryness. We're coming into a hot, dry summer, possibly. Maybe it's a hot, wet summer. We don't know. But if there are times of drought, watering trees, established trees, and getting established trees is going to go a long ways to care for them. Oh, there it goes again. All right. So what do you do if you have mature trees already? What if you've already got a large canopy around you? Well, you want to assess those trees. You want to assess them for health problems. You want to take note of what is happening in the canopy, what is happening around the root zone. And you want to just make note. And you want to do this over and over again, every year if possible, every couple of years. Document it on paper, make notes. Also in photographs, so you have a record of changes in the tree. Keep in mind that it is possible for a tree to have more than one issue occurring that might lead to some challenges later on. And then scout for symptoms and signs, but also if you're not comfortable doing this, if you have the ability to, I strongly recommend hiring a certified arborist. These folks are trained to look for defects, to look for potential points of failure. It's worth the money, to invest in taking care of your trees, and hiring a certified arborist can go a long ways to doing that. So as trees mature, they get great size. Part of the assessment would be a risk management assessment. And so what arborists look for when they're assessing trees in terms of their risk would be first and foremost a potential for failure. Like, what are the chances that the tree has a failure? Are there points of weakness? Is it structurally a challenge for the tree to support the canopy that it's hosting? What is the environment around it? Have there been changes to the environment that are weakening the tree, that is changing the environment that the tree grew up in? Something would be like construction. Was there nearby construction that occurred that maybe disturbed that root zone? And for a very large tree, if there was construction and it minimized the root zone, that can affect how the tree is able to support itself. And then finally, potential targets. What are the potential targets? So in a community, like in the photo I have here, this tree was struck by lightning. It was removed with rapid speed, but it was done so likely because this is a very popular park in the community. There's a lot of activity happening here. There's a lot of vehicles that park here. There's a lot of kids that play here. There's a couple of ball fields. There's events that are hosted here. So those targets, the buildings, the people, the cars, are prevalent. Now, if you have a tree in the back 40 that gets struck by lightning, and maybe it's in your pasture, or maybe there's very few people that are going to be around it, perhaps there's less of a target for that tree to fail on, and so your assessment might result in a different conclusion. And then finally, the assessment will look for defects and decay. I'll show you some examples of what this looks like later, but those are points of weakness. And so noting those, monitoring their progress, monitoring where they're at on the tree can help you make informed decisions about how that tree is going to be managed and how it might weather in a storm event. And like I said, monitor regularly and track your changes. Trees are very long-lived, hopefully, very long-lived specimen. And so sometimes they can change and they can decline slowly, and we don't notice it at the human scale. And so by doing regular checks and by tracking those in written and in pictorial form can go a long ways into picking up on those changes. And then knowing signs and symptoms. So in order to do this, looking for signs and symptoms, you need to know what the species is. That's the first step to anything, to any diagnosis, is to know what species you're working with. So the two pictures I have here, one is a white pine, the other one is a dawn redwood. The one perhaps on the right, you say, oh my goodness, like look at it, looks like it has drought stress, or there's something happening because those leaves are browning. Like that's not normal for a tree. Well, it is for this one because it's also a deciduous conifer, and this photo was taken in October. And so that's the normal habit for a tree of this species to do that. So it is not concerning. So knowing the species that you're looking for or looking at is one of the very first steps. Look for patterns of these signs and symptoms, and so you can better assess what is going on. And then, like I said earlier, like stepping back and looking at the site, have there been changes? Has drainage patterns changed? Have there been disturbance to the root system? Has there been major damage to the canopy? Taking note of these changes and assessing how the tree is responding can help lead you to perhaps challenges that the tree might have withstanding a weather event. And then you want to assess the entire specimen. So a lot of times we run up to a tree and we look up in the canopy and say, oh, it looks so beautiful. I'm exaggerating, of course, but a tree assessment, a complete tree assessment is of the entire tree. So stepping back, and I like to step back and just take an overall assessment of the canopy, note the large scale changes or the large scale observations, and then progressively move closer, and then analyze the canopy, the foliage of the canopy, the trunk, like doing a full walk around of the tree, and then looking down and looking at the root zone when the roots and seeing what is happening there. So to assess the root zone, which sometimes we don't often do, you start at the base. You got to keep in mind that the root zone of a tree, a mature tree, can reach 3 to 5 times the spread of the canopy. So you're going to want to, like I said, take that full scale look. And so the photos I have here are the result of a tree that had circling roots. And you can see what that looks like here in this top picture. In the container, when it was planted, those were not corrected. And so those roots continued to grow in a circular pattern around the tree. Tree roots grow from the tip. And so unless they're corrected at planting time, they're going to continue to circle around the trunk of the tree. And what happens over time is this smaller tree grows into a larger tree, as you can see here on the left, and that trunk expands and the roots expand and they start conflicting with each other and constricting each other. And so you can see what happened here is that it's basically, I like to describe it as like tying your shoes together and then pushing someone over. Like it cannot hold itself up. That root zone is not capable of holding the tree up. And so that would have been something that during an assessment, you would have made note of that and assessed. And this tree I found on, you can see it leaning here. There's a house near it. So that would have been a potential target, but it just fell over. There was no significant storm event, but imagine if there was a storm event, that would have been equally as susceptible. And then signs of rot and decay. I see this much more than I would like to on trees. So the signs of rot or decay would be things like a fungal fruiting body on a trunk, hollows, or cavities in a tree. That's a surefire way to detect some decay. Splits or cracks or lightning scars. The tree I showed you earlier that got hit by lightning it succumbed right away to it. Others don't. And so looking for some of those scars along the trunk of a tree that can be a location where decay can infect the tree and weaken its ability to hold itself up. And then if you're uncomfortable with this, or if you have questions, contact a certified arborist, again, for an evaluation. Always contact an arborist if you have questions. And then signs of structural weakness would be those hollows or those cavities like you saw on that tree. Tree biology is that the heartwood in the center of the tree hardens and it's supportive structure. And so it's supporting the tree. Well, if you remove that, that makes the tree more susceptible to failure. And so those hollows and those cavities are a place where infection has entered decay has entered, and it is going to continue to move through that tree. Is there dead wood in the canopy? Is there anywhere are there limbs that have died that need to be removed? Are there broken or hanging branches that need to be removed? And that could be signs of structural weakness or points of failure. And then narrow branch angles. So this is one that maybe wasn't top of mind for folks, but narrow branch angles on a tree can be a point of structural weakness. What happens is, like I said, with the root system, the trunks expand, the roots expand, and they start conflicting with each other. Well, the same thing can happen with narrow branch angles. I've got a picture of it coming up, but those two branches or the trunk and a branch will start growing together, and the bark that was there once on the outside of the trunk and the branch can start becoming squeezed in between, and that is called included bark, and that is a point of structural weakness. And I've got some pretty dramatic pictures of that coming up, so stay tuned. So then leaf size. So again, knowing what species you have can go a long ways to help indicate, what is happening with the tree. You can be looking for nutrient deficiencies. Knowing what the normal species looks like is really important. So you got nutrient deficiencies, maybe environmental stress is impacting that tree. Leaves will tell you a lot about that. Then physical impairment and stress. And so in these two pictures that I have here, one is a pin oak, that large tree, the one with the whole tree is a pin oak. And the next to it, I've got my beloved catalpa. And so you can see that both kind of have this like yellowish, greenish tinge to the leaves. Well, if you know the species and you know what those species are, what is normal for the leaf material in that tree, you would know that a pin oak is susceptible, and it's common to see chlorosis, an iron deficiency, exhibit itself on the canopy of the tree. So that's not normal. It is normal for Northern Illinois, but it's not what the tree should look like. We know that is tied to a nutrient deficiency, as opposed to the catalpa. It just has these large leaves that are kind of chartreuse, yellowish, bright green in color. That's the normal coloration of the leaves. And so we wouldn't need to be as concerned if we see that exhibiting. And then finally, looking at previous year's growth, like how healthy is a tree? This can help you determine if the tree is growing well, if it is not. And so I put this picture in here, and you can see, I encourage all of you to get out and look at your trees and look at last year's growth, and then monitor for this year's growth, and get this skill practice. But you can see last year here where the terminal bud was, terminal bud broke and put out a couple of starter branches here. And then you can see how much growth, I hope you can see my mouse here, but how much growth this oak tree put on last year. That's pretty significant for an oak tree. It seems to be happy and healthy where it's living. Knowing how much growth had occurred and then how much growth you should expect can help you determine whether the tree is thriving or not. I've got a river birch just near this tree. It's also doing very well. But for river birch, it put on about 18 inches of growth in 1 year. It was very, very happy where it's at. That would be unheard of on an oak. I just would not see that kind of growth on an oak. But if my river birch had 6 inches of growth, that would be a little more concerning, and I would make note of that and want to observe how that tree was doing in the following years. And then signs of pests. Pests are often a secondary problem to the main issue of a tree. And then knowing if you've got a pest, if it is a biotic or abiotic. So I've got these 2 photos here. You probably all know what's going on with the tree. On the right-hand side, that is in fact an ash, and it has been infected with emerald ash borer. Knowing that, knowing it's an ash tree, knowing emerald ash borer is present in the area, knowing the signs and symptoms of it, you can deduce that that's what's going on there. Left untreated, that will be fatal to the ash tree. As opposed to the photo on the right, this is a linden. That's Japanese beetle damage. It does that to the whole tree every single year. Or it does not kill the tree. It will stress it though. And so knowing that the tree is stressed, so it could be a contributing factor to a tree declining or being weakened and more susceptible to storm damage or other threats. And then, like I had said earlier, assessing your potential targets, knowing where a tree potentially would fall, and making decisions based on the evaluation. Going back to that emerald ash borer in this house, you can see that this tree right on the right-hand side, right in front of that Japanese maple there, that red tree, that very tall one, I believe is an ash. It exhibits all the symptoms of emerald ash borer, and so it's declining. You can see that there's dead limbs right above that house, and that is concerning. And so I want to assess, how we're going to be able to deal with that. So how do we deal with it? Oftentimes it's pruning. Pruning can help remove dead limbs, can help remove diseased limbs, or dying or declining. And so pruning to me is the best and or worst thing you can do for a tree, depending on how it's done. So you want to make the correct pruning cut, and I've got illustrations here. And so you want to prune at a bud or a branch. You can see here we pruned right there. At the branch union, you can see that we left some branch remaining. That's because we are leaving the branch bark collar. So there's a swelling at the base of each union of a trunk and a branch, and that is structural material that helps support the weight of the branch. You want to make sure you leave that intact, because those stem cells are also sealing materials. So trees don't heal, they seal. And so when I say seal, like it'll cover over the wound. If you remove that, it's going to make the tree much less able to compartmentalize, to seal off that wound, and it's going to increase your chances of having that decay enter into the heartwood and compromising the structure of the tree. And so, like I said, pruning can be fantastic. It can help strengthen trees. It can help form them, remove double leaders, but if you've done it in an inappropriate way or in an incorrect way, it can really threaten the overall wellness of a tree. Flush cuts, I put this in here. This is advice from way back yesteryear. That's when you would simply just cut right along the line of the tree. Again, that removes that branch bark collar. It is not advised. Please don't do it anymore. And this lower picture here, what we want to do is preserve all of this bark around the branch bark collar. In this picture below here, that's a 3-point pruning method. If you have a larger branch that you want to remove, you would do 3 cuts. The first would be an undercut, on a foot or 2 away from the union where you're actually going to make your final cut. But that's your first cut. Then you would come out on the outside of that cut and cut from the top. And what you see happen here is that this bark ripped down under the weight of the branch. Your first cut stops that from ripping all the way back into the trunk of the tree. And then you would make your third pruning cut where you would have a good finished product. But that can go a long ways in making sure that trees are healthy. And then the branch angles, I had mentioned this earlier. You can see that this is a nice kind of wide branch angle. You want a nice U or V-shaped at 45 degrees to 90 degrees is ideal. Knowing the branching habits of your species is going to help you assess what is normal, how you can prune it, and how you can manage it. But that's the recommendations for the strongest branch angles, and the ones most able to withstand extra weight from a snow event or wind event. And so pruning ahead of time and helping shape the tree can do wonders for making sure that it is as resilient as possible. Some bark damage. I'm just going to fly through these pretty quick to reinforce why good pruning and why good tree care is important. This right here is where 3-point pruning cut was not used, and it ripped the tree. You can see that bark ripped off of it. That is a point of potential infection. Here it looks like there's been some rubbing on a tree, perhaps by an animal. But then you can also see down below, we've got that tree protection that has been left on far too long, and that is causing damage to the bark, which is a point of potential infection, for the tree. And then finally, a tie that has been left on too long. You can just see that tree like a girdle, just squeezing it, and that can be a point of weakness in a storm event, where the bark is just not as strong because that tie has been left on too long. And so as we're all out and about a little bit more and looking at our trees, just keep an eye out for those kind of situations and do what you can to correct them. It'll make your tree more resilient. So I mentioned about co-dominant leaders and included bark. This is a sad story of a tree. That linden tree that I had showed you earlier, I inherited this tree in my front yard. It had 6 leaders. You can see right here on the right-hand side, like this tree was a hot mess. It was too late to do any corrective pruning. There were no targets. It was way out in the front yard. We would drive by it every once in a while, but really it was not a concern that it would fall on any significant target. And so we left it. I made it known to our realtor and my husband that it would fail. They didn't love that assessment, but you can see that in the middle here, there was organic matter that had accumulated. There was included bark there. And so you can see where all that bark material just like grew together as the tree matured. And so that was a point of weakness. And so we just watched it. And then we had a storm event, a wind event, nothing significant. This was not a derecho. This was not a tornado. It was a pretty strong windstorm, but here in the Midwest, we get those occasionally, and the tree did in fact fail. But what you can see here is where there was that, that decay occurring. We saw the signs of it up top, the organic matter, accumulating in that bowl of the tree, and then moisture sat in there, and it just deteriorated down into the tree, and that structure was not able to support the canopy in a windstorm, and so. That's one tale that we can tell of a tree that failed. Also assessing trees for their balance. These trees are not well balanced. This tree over here, you can see there's a lot. It's been pruned to accommodate those power lines, which is appropriate. You don't want trees and power lines conflicting with each other, but the moral of the story is to not plant a large maple underneath the power line because it's going to eventually grow into it. And it is now off balance. You've got a lot more weight over here on the right-hand side than you do on the left-hand side. Similarly to this tree, again, this tree is concerning for a lot of reasons, but then you've got this large limb becoming a dominant leader coming off to the right. And that is a concern because of the weight, it leaning so far to that side. And so assessing the balance of a tree. And so you just want resilient trees. Like all this goes to make resilient trees. We just want to make sure we're taking care of our trees as best we can, keeping them healthy, making sure they're planted properly, watering and mulching, and investing in pruning all leads to trees that are better able to withstand storm events. Maintenance, doing this over the life of the tree, especially when there's times of dryness, it would be watering. Watering, soaking a deep soak into the soil, watering trees during dryness can help promote health. Avoiding mechanical damage. We're all probably got our mowers fired up, I would guess. Mower damage can be detrimental to tree health, and so avoiding mechanical damage. Don't run into them with vehicles or I've seen some trees like along boulevards, like if they have some damage, it needs to be assessed and monitored. Mulching is a really valuable tool to help promote tree health, except when it's piled up on the trunk. And so I wanted to make sure to make the point to not do what we call volcano mulch. It's where it's just piled right up on top of the trunk. Again, mulch is meant to hold moisture in the soil. It's meant to, help, keep the soil cool and moist. You do not want that moisture right up against the trunk of the tree. That can be a point of infection. And so think of donuts. I do believe, I have not yet met a person that does not like a donut in some form or another. But to me, mulch should look like the donuts with the circle in the middle, like your traditional donut, where it's mounded up around it and the trunk is entering the ground without mulch touching it. And then if you must stake, you would do it securely but loosely so the tree can move. And I'll talk about why that's important here in a little bit, but you want to make sure that you remove those ties as soon as the tree has established, usually within a year or two. Go out and take those off to help promote health. But we live in the Midwest and storms happen. And so I want to take a few minutes here to just generally address tree care after storms. There are some general guidelines, and then I'll get into a few specifics about certain weather related or specific weather related events. And so first, safety first, always. Safety, safety, safety. If you get nothing else from today, please keep in mind that safety first. No tree, no property is as valuable as your lives. And so you must just be careful after a storm event has downed trees or damaged trees. It is recommended that you hire a professional arborist if work needs to be done. If a chainsaw or ladder are required, please call a professional. These are extremely dangerous tools, in my opinion. Chainsaws are available at all of our local businesses, but they're very powerful. And so hire a professional arborist. If you have a tree down near a utility area, stay away from it. Call your utility company, of course. Make sure that is not a live wire. Before trees can conduct electricity, and so you don't touch a tree with touching a utility line. Don't do anything but call your utility and let them deal with it. And then you can wonder if a tree is worth saving. You would want to talk to a professional arborist. It's not as black and white as you might want it to be, especially after a storm. It's hard to make that decision whether you want to take a beloved tree down or not. So a professional arborist can help you assess and make that decision as informed as you can be. Finally, watch for scams. Unfortunately, there are unscrupulous people that try to take advantage of weather events. A lot of these events can be extremely emotional for folks. And there's also some level of chaos sometimes with them. And so there can be folks showing up with a chainsaw and saying that they can help with your tree. So just be on the lookout. What that means is you would, if you're looking to hire an arborist, they would be able to show you proof of certification that they are an arborist, and then they would carry insurance. And you could see both of those documentations. And if they can't produce those, then it is my recommendation that you find somebody that can produce a certification and proof of insurance. So immediately after a storm, if possible, like it's a small tree, if it blew over, fell over, was uprooted, straighten it, stake it. It can be done immediately after storms. You don't want to wait on this. Again, safety first, but as soon as you can to straighten that tree back up. This is when stakes would be used. You would stake them evenly around the tree to make sure that it is well secured. You would use a thin rope or a wire, don't use a thin rope or a wire, that damages the tree. You would want to use some sort of soft material like smooth surface to stake it. So like a wide canvas strap, strips of old carpeting, like bicycle inner tubes or burlap. They're not as common anymore, but I've used pantyhose. You would cut the tops off of women's pantyhose. They're flexible. They can deteriorate if you forget to take them off. A lot of times they'll kind of start breaking down on their own. But the old wire and garden hose is not recommended. It can damage the tree. It can rub on the bark and damage the tree. And then again, remove it as soon as possible. Trees they're not going to run away on you. So they don't need to be tied down forever. You just want to make sure that they can get reestablished and then remove those. Corrective pruning. We've already talked about how to prune, but you would want to look for when it's safe, and if you're on the ground, look for areas where you can remove like jagged or broken or protruding limbs. The photo here was an intentional cut. It just was done incorrectly, but you would want to come up and clean that up. Anything that is dead, diseased, or damaged, or the 3Ds, you would automatically remove from a tree. That's a no question. Then you would want to consult a professional to see what other types of corrective pruning would be recommended. Now, I have to make a comment if it's an oak tree, because oak trees do get damaged in storms. There is oak wilt that is prevalent in the Midwest. This is a fatal disease that can be transferred to oak trees. Now, after a storm event, it is recommended that you still do corrective pruning on an oak, but you want to make sure that you apply to that wound a latex-based paint, like a latex-based house paint, to that wound within about 10 minutes of making that cut to prevent insects actually carry the fungal spores to the tree, and they're attracted to the wounds. And so by applying that latex paint, you're going to help minimize the risk of that fungal disease being transferred to your oak tree. So if your oaks need some corrective pruning, take those precautions. All right. So now I want to talk about some of the specifics with some of the natural disasters, the weather-related disasters that we have. They impact our trees oftentimes in similarly like devastating ways, but different ways. And so we need to adapt our responses depending on what type of weather event we have experienced or we are experiencing. So first, flood. So in flooding conditions, the soil is saturated, right? The soil water holding capacity has exceeded its capabilities. And so what happens, especially if it's a long-term flood, is that the soil becomes anaerobic. Remember that tree roots need air and water. And so if they have all the water and none of the air, that can be detrimental to root growth and root life. And so you can actually lose root mass in a flood or after a flood. Also, you can have contamination. If you can see here, this is in an urban environment. I imagine that there were some oils on the surface of the paving material. There were possibly fertilizers on the surrounding turf grass. Those contaminants can move in that water, especially if it's got some sort of current to it, which it always will, as it's going to flood. That can be detrimental to trees. Trees don't really need fertilizer, but they don't need oil. They don't need these chemical compounds, and so that can negatively affect the health of the tree. On the converse side of that, erosion can be a concern when there's flood waters, and so you want to make sure that you're doing an assessment immediately after a flood has occurred to make sure that the root zone is intact, and you can do what you can to mitigate those impacts, be it chemicals. Now, be very careful with chemicals. They can impact human health as well as tree health. And so take precautions, wear protective clothing, but then also if there's been erosion, to help protect that root zone and replace that soil. Trunk damage is another concern, especially if there's flowing water. You want to assess your tree and make sure that debris hasn't bumped up against it, hasn't stripped the bark at any location. What we can do ahead of time, this goes back to that right tree, right place. There are species that are more susceptible or more tolerant of flood. So if you have an area where you see relatively regular flooding occur, it would be recommended to try one of these species. So amongst them, this is not a all-inclusive list, but amongst them would be things like the bald cypress, the cottonwood, hackberries, hawthorns, honey locust, pin oak, swamp white oak, river birch, quaking aspen, And then the black gum or tupelo would be a few of the species to consider before the flood. After the flood, you would want to understand how long the tree was submerged. This can affect how the tree is responding. What were the conditions again of the tree before it was in a flood situation. And so then there's tornadoes. So according to the National Weather Service, I love this definition. It says a tornado is a violently rotating column of air extending from the base of a thunderstorm down to the ground. I think that's accurate. It is violently rotating column of air. But what that means is that these dynamic forces can wind whip or twist the trunks of trees and cause them to fail. So some of the major concerns with tornadoes would be that there's trunk or limb just breakage. You can see that pretty immediately. It's the most common type of injury in a tornado situation. The twisting of a trunk, so that when the tornado is spinning, the twist, so the tree can actually, kind of twist. You cannot always see that damage. It doesn't always break the tree. It doesn't always, it's not always visible to the outside. What you want to be able to do, or what you want to do, is monitor, overall or long-term health of that tree. If you're going to keep the tree, if the tree is in a good enough condition initially to stay in the landscape, just monitor it for that tree trunk. Bent trees, winds outside of the tornado, or just on the peripheral of where it is that can bend the trees. Now, bent trees can survive if they haven't been broken or cracked, but it might not be some damage that's visible immediately. And so you want to assess that. And then there's, wounds, including debarking a tree. I've seen trees just totally stripped of bark under the pressure of a tornado wind. Tornadoes are also oftentimes accompanied by like massive storms, right? So hail or, powerful rain. Also, they throw things, you can see, debris in these trees. So that can cause wounds to trees. And so if you're going to maintain a tree after a tornado event, just make sure you monitor these trees because they can be more susceptible to disease or pests. And then finally, root damage. So uprooted trees, if you're try to replant them, again, making sure that they are healthy enough and young enough and in adequate position to be replanted, and then monitor those. They can be susceptible to fungal or insects over time, but making sure that you just continue to monitor those trees. And then finally, tornadoes will sometimes also be accompanied by floods. So going back to the previous conversation about flooding, standing water from flash floods or these very large storm events can impact trees as well. And so monitoring and taking action. Now you might think that this is a redundant conversation with windstorms, following tornadoes, but they're similar and different. So let's explore how. So generally speaking, windstorms are less damaging than tornadoes. So the reason being that as trees grow, they are experiencing wind, maybe not at the same level as what would be a concerning windstorm, but they're experiencing wind. And so that movement allows them to develop strong but flexible wood. And so this gives them some resilience, right? This is called wind firmness in trees. And this is why you don't stake trees so harshly either. This is going back to the earlier comment of you want to stake these trees loosely but firmly so they can move and sway and develop some of that resilience. Now, when a windstorm is above wind speed conditions that are quote unquote normal for the area or what the tree is able to tolerate, some of the damage that can occur would be breaking. This again is the most common, where limbs or trunks are broken, they're snapped in the wind. If not dealt with or removed, again, can be susceptible infestation or infection locations for pests or diseases. Wounds and debarking, again, wind throwing debris, can impact trees. Blowing over, trees can just topple over when the whole structure fails. And so, assessing whether those trees can be put back up, or if they are broken or are at an inappropriate age or condition to replant. And then also like root damage. So if it's not completely tipped over, roots are still going to be strained, in a windstorm. Think of what they're doing. They're supporting the entire canopy of a tree. They're the structure of it. They're holding the tree upright. So under the force of that wind, depending on how fast, the wind was moving, what the wind speed was, but also how long it was sustained for, can impact the roots. And so doing an assessment of the roots immediately after a windstorm and then monitoring it as time goes on is recommended. This, roots are also, they're structural, but they're also conducting water and nutrients. And so some of the symptoms of root damage can manifest in the canopy of a tree. And so you want to make sure that you're continuing to monitor. So ice storms, so ice is the accumulation on branches. It dramatically impacts or increases the weight load on the limbs. Ice and snow are extremely heavy at times, and so it can increase the weight of a canopy up to 30 times the natural weight of a tree. Now, this can lead again to broken limbs. In a winter storm, it leaves trees vulnerable to pests and insects. In addition to extra weight, ice storms are often accompanied or can be accompanied by extreme cold. And so this can impact tree health as well. It's often, if the tree is planted in a hardiness zone that it is suited for, it oftentimes will not kill a tree. These deep colds, it certainly can, depending again on the level of freeze and the duration of it. But what you're going to want to do in an ice storm or in a cold spell is monitor long term. Like, how is the tree doing in the following year, in the following couple of years? Things like a deep cold can manifest over a couple of seasons. Immediately, it might look like a reduced flower or fruit production on a tree. You might have like damaged twigs. You could have some dieback in the canopy. What's tricky about this is about these challenges these ailments that manifest themselves later on in the season, is that you can start thinking that it might be something else affecting the tree. So, like if it were an oak tree that had some ice damage or cold damage, and there would be flagging, you might get concerned that it was oak wilt. So doing an assessment and utilizing all the resources available can help. That tracking can help you better understand what's happening after an ice storm. Drought, we had this last year. So unlike the previously discussed weather conditions, droughts are extended oftentimes, and they impact, again, the impact can be seen, it can be slow to manifest, and it can be slow to happen over time. And so sometimes years can go by and you can lose trees, or you can have some of those symptoms or those, the results of a drought showing up over years. Even I was reading that it's qualified as a short-lived drought as one growing season. So we had that last year. We had a one growing season drought that can have long-term health impacts. It made me pause, just because in the Midwest, we often do just have one season droughts. We don't often experience these really long-term droughts, but it can happen. We don't know what this year will bring. So along with drought too, though, trees have evolved to deal with water stress. And so they can handle a lack of water for short term. Like that's an evolutionary coping mechanism that trees have developed. Additional things that can impact how a tree is going to respond to drought would be the soil conditions, the soil composition, or the topography. And I think this gets overlooked sometimes, in that knowing what your soil is like that tree is residing in can help you understand what that root system has developed like. So like shallow root systems are often trees that have shallow root systems are impacted to a greater degree for drought than soil or trees that have been able to develop really deep root systems, like say in a sandy soil where they have been seeking out water for a while. And during a drought, they could potentially, tap into some of those reserves that are deeper in the soil profile. Shallow rooted system or trees don't have that capability. They can't evolve or modify that quickly. And so when a drought happens above ground and that top layer of soil is not being replenished with water, those trees can suffer more so than deep-rooted trees. Immediate symptoms of a drought would look like things like curling leaves, leaf burn or browning, premature leaf or needle drop, or premature color change in the leaf material or dried out needles. Longer term, it's just weakening of the tree. It is a stressor. Drought is a major stressor of trees, and so oftentimes what you'll see is that the tree has been significantly stressed, and then it makes it more susceptible to pests and disease. Also, reduced growth in the following years can be a symptom of drought. That's where you would look at the terminal bud growth for the previous years, and you can monitor and see if it's growing at the same levels that it had been previously. This is just because the root stores have been depleted. Like during a drought, the tree is in survival mode, and so in the following years, that tree doesn't have those stores, and so it can suffer. And then finally, this is maybe not one that everybody always thinks of, but I think it's certainly a natural disaster. Pests, such as emerald ash borer and pathogens such as oak wilt are impacting our trees in dramatic ways. The difference being that these pests and pathogens oftentimes are invasive species. These are general statements, but they're generally invasive species. They generally are species specific. And so they're like emerald ash borer is attacking fraxinus. So it's going after all of your fraxinus trees. Oak wilt attacks oak trees. That's the blessing of it. So unlike our previous weather-related disasters, this is going to affect certain species. But similarly, in an unrelated or in an unlike our previous talked about weather-related events, people are doing a lot of the work here for these pests and pathogens. Oftentimes we are moving them. So it's a much more widespread infection. It's slow moving oftentimes because people are moving them, but it can be really widespread. And so with that strong human influence, and so taking preventative measures can help protect our trees and our forests from pests and pathogens. One of these preventative measures is to, of course, have healthy trees, but have a diverse variety or a diverse species mix. So think back to like emerald or Dutch elm disease. So we have these historic photos of boulevards just lined with elm trees, just a monoculture of elms on both sides, just arching over it. It's stunning. And you just want to, you want to live there. The problem is though, when Dutch elm disease came in, it took out all of those trees. They were all susceptible to it. That monoculture was gone. It cleared, we clear cut the elms out of our landscape. And so by having a diverse planting of trees, you would lose an elk or you would lose an elm here, or we would lose an ash here, or we would lose like a walnut here, an oak here, and it would the devastation that it would provide probably would not reach that disaster level. And so pests and pathogens, like I said, it's probably not something we always think about when we think of tree risks in the traditional natural disaster way, but I certainly categorize it as a risk to our trees. So finally, our takeaway messages, right? What do we do? Before the storm, we need to care for our trees. We just need to be doing as best a job as we can to plant the right tree in the right place, making sure it's healthy and resilient and able to withstand what comes at it. A lot of these weather-related events, actually all these weather-related events, we cannot stop from happening. We cannot change the path of a tornado. Sometimes we can do something to affect flood, but generally no. Generally we cannot mitigate flooding around trees, and so planting trees and making sure they're able to withstand what nature is going to throw at it. Again, assessing mature trees and taking action if there's a threat or if they are susceptible. If there's a potential to cause harm, handling it, doing something to make sure that those trees are dealt with before an event occurs. And then finding a good arborist, building a relationship with that arborist. You can find local ones. You can go to treesaregood.org, and you can type in your zip code and you can find local arborists, certified arborists in your area. And so call them, get to know these folks, get their number. And so if, an event happens, you're ready to go. And then finally, after a storm event, like call that professional that you just met. Make sure that you have that person's, on your person's name on your contact list. And so you've got that ready to go. Safety first. Avoid, downed trees that are, interacting with power lines. Be careful if it's been a flood event and, the contamination that's going to be there. Sincerely, like your life is not worth any of the property or the trees. So be very, very careful. And then after, monitor your trees. If you do keep a tree in your landscape, monitor it for long-term health impacts. And then finally, replant. I encourage everybody to replant. I don't think we have enough trees in our landscape ever, so you'll never hear me say not to replant. But I've just seen a lot of heartbroken homeowners. I've experienced, unfortunately, a number of different storm events, and I know that it can be really, really heartbreaking when you lose trees. And but we can always replant, and we can work to mitigate our risks too.